Damien Kwan, head of the Golden Coil Syndicate, existed in a world of polished chrome and refrigerated air. His penthouse office was a monument to brutalist architecture and emotional vacancy, its floor-to-ceiling windows offering a conqueror's view of Seoul sprawling below. He was a man carved from granite and grief, his bespoke suits the armor around a soul frozen solid years ago. Today, that armor was being tested by something far more insidious than a rival's blade: boredom. 10 models, flown in from across the globe, stood in a silent, trembling line. They were exquisite, impossibly long-limbed and hollow-cheeked, the new faces intended to launch his legitimate enterprise, Kwan Cosmetics, into the global stratosphere. Each one was a perfect, sterile piece of art, and they left him utterly cold. His lieutenant, Mr. Park, a man whose permanent expression was one of quiet apology for the universe's imperfections, stood stiffly by the door. He watched his boss, whose stillness was more menacing than any overt threat. Damien's dark eyes, chips of obsidian, swept over the women without seeing them. He saw only angles, hunger, and a desperate desire to please that he found repulsive. He was about to dismiss them all, to send them back to their vapid lives with a wave of his hand, when a scent, faint and impossibly out of place, snagged in the sterile air. It was a ghost. A warm, spicy, deeply familiar aroma that had no business being in this glass cage. It was the smell of gochujang, of sesame oil, of something rich and deeply fermented. It was the smell of a life he had buried. His head lifted, a predator catching a scent on the wind. The models flinched. Mr. Park's posture became even more rigid. The temperature in the room, already frigid, seemed to drop another 10 degrees. Amara Jackson believed in the gospel of a full belly and a paid-up electricity bill. At 18, her world was the polar opposite of the glittering city she could glimpse from the bus window. It was a cramped, fourth-floor walk-up that always smelled faintly of her neighbor's kimchi stew and her own anxieties. Her body, full-figured and soft in a world that prized sharp edges, was built for comfort, not for speed. Her hands, though, were magic. They could take flour, water, and a few precious spices and turn them into survival. Today, survival looked like a Tupperware container, its plastic clouded from 1,000 washes, filled with kimchi noodles. The recipe was her inheritance, a sacred text passed down from her grandmother, who'd been taught by her best friend, a Korean War bride who settled in Atlanta. It was a fusion of histories, a dish of profound love and humble origins. She packed it carefully into her worn tote bag, its strap frayed and held together with a safety pin. Her job as a catering assistant was a grueling, thankless gig that barely kept the eviction notices at bay. Today's assignment was for some new cosmetics company launch, an audition, or something. All she knew was that it was in the city's most expensive tower, a place that felt like another planet. Pulling on her scuffed work clogs, she gave one last look at the red-inked bill on her small kitchen table. The number stared back at her, a silent threat. She clutched the tote bag tighter. The noodles inside weren't just lunch. They were a shield, a small, warm piece of home she could carry into the cold, intimidating world that awaited her. She was just a girl with a container of noodles, walking into the lion's den. The air in the penthouse was thick with expensive perfume and unspoken terror. Amara kept to the periphery, a small, warm planet in a galaxy of cold, distant stars. Her job was simple: keep the water glasses full and stay invisible. She watched the models, creatures from a magazine, all jutting collarbones and vacant stares. They looked like they hadn't eaten a real meal in their lives. She felt a pang of something between pity and profound alienation. Tucked away in a small alcove behind a decorative screen, she decided to steal a few minutes for lunch. Her stomach rumbled, a small, embarrassing rebellion in the cathedral of silence. Carefully, she lifted the lid from her Tupperware. The scent bloomed into the air, a warm, fragrant cloud of garlic, ginger, and chili. It was the smell of her grandmother's kitchen, of comfort, of love. It was the smell of everything this place was not. Across the vast room, Damien Kwan went rigid. The scent cut through the sterile air like a warm blade, bypassing his defenses and plunging directly into his memory. "What is that?" His voice was low, a dangerous rumble. Every person in the room froze. The models looked at each other in panic, wondering which of their designer fragrances had offended him. Mr. Park stepped forward. "Sir? Is something wrong?" Damien ignored him. He was already moving. He walked not like a man, but like a force of nature, a storm front rolling across the polished marble floor. The models parted before him like reeds in a river. His eyes scanned the room, hunting. He followed the scent, the ghost of his past, to the decorative screen. He pushed it aside. And there she was. A young woman, a girl really, with wide, terrified eyes and a smudge of flour on her cheek. She was holding a plastic container of noodles, a fork halfway to her lips. She was soft where the world was hard, warm where he was frozen. And she smelled like home. Amara's heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic drumbeat against the sudden, oppressive silence. The man looming over her was terrifying. He was dressed in a suit so perfectly tailored it seemed fused to his broad shoulders, his presence sucking all the oxygen from her small alcove. His face was a mask of cold fury, his dark eyes fixed not on her, but on the Tupperware container in her trembling hands. "What is that?" he repeated, his voice a low growl that vibrated through the floor. She couldn't find her voice. Her throat had closed up, tight with fear. She could only stare, her fork frozen in midair. He didn't wait for an answer. With a swift, precise movement, he reached down and plucked the fork from her grasp. He dipped it into the noodles, collecting a small tangle glistening with crimson sauce. The entire room held its breath. Mr. Park looked as if he were about to witness a public execution. Damien brought the fork to his lips. He tasted it. The universe stopped. The cold mask on his face didn't just crack, it shattered. For a split second, a storm of emotions washed over his features. Shock, disbelief, a profound and gut-wrenching sorrow that made him look impossibly young. The bitterness, the acidity, the depth of the fermentation, the subtle hint of orange zest his mother used to add as her secret, it was all there. It was his mother's ghost on his tongue. He closed his eyes. He wasn't in a penthouse in Seoul. He was 7 years old, in a small, steamy kitchen, watching his mother's hands, her smile as she let him have the first taste. A single tear escaped his closed lid, tracing a hot path down his cold cheek. He opened his eyes, the devastation replaced by an immediate, terrifying clarity. He turned to the room. "Get them out," he commanded, his voice raw. "All of them," Mr. Park blinked. "Sir? The models. Fire them. Get them out of my building. Now." The models were ushered out in a flurry of confusion and indignation, their perfect faces marred by shock. The catering manager stammered apologies, gathering his staff to flee the wrath of the man who had just imploded his own multi-million-dollar campaign launch. But Damien's hand shot out, not in anger, but as a barrier. "Not her," he said, his voice quiet but absolute. He gestured with his chin toward Amara, who was still frozen in her alcove, clutching her empty Tupperware container like a life raft. She was the last one left in the vast, silent room, besides Damien and the ever-present Mr. Park. The silence stretched, thick and heavy. Damien walked back to her, his movements slow, deliberate. He looked down at the plastic box in her hands, as if it were the most precious artifact on earth. "Where did you get this recipe?" he asked. The question was soft, but it carried the weight of a life's worth of pain. Amara finally found her voice, though it came out as a shaky whisper. My grandmother. She learned it from a friend. A long time ago," he nodded slowly, a dark, unreadable emotion in his eyes. He saw the worn fabric of her tote bag, the scuff marks on her shoes, the anxiety in her posture. He saw her struggle written all over her. And in that moment, he made a decision that defied all logic, all business sense, all the cold rules he lived by. "You work for me now," he stated. It was not a question. "Mr. Park will handle the details. You will have an apartment in this building. Your only job is to cook this for me." Every day, Amara stared at him, her mind struggling to process the whiplash. Fired models. A terrifying man crying. And now this. I don't understand." "You don't have to," Damien said, his voice softening almost imperceptibly. "Just cook." He turned and walked toward his private office, leaving Amara standing in the wreckage of her old life, on the precipice of a new one she couldn't begin to comprehend. In a dimly lit room across the city, smelling of stale cigarette smoke and cheap soju, Kong Jinwoo laughed. The sound was like grinding glass. He had been circling Damien Kwan for years, a patient predator waiting for the lion to show a sign of weakness. For a decade, Damien had been a fortress, impenetrable, disciplined, cold. But the whispers coming out of the Kwan Tower today were too delicious, too strange to be anything but the truth. Fired 10 international models? Jinwoo sneered, swirling the liquor in his glass. For a catering girl? His underling, a man with a nervous tic and too much ambition, nodded eagerly. They say he tasted her food, and just broke. Crying, they said. He's moved her into the tower, given her a penthouse suite. Jinwoo leaned back, a slow, cruel smile spreading across his face. This wasn't just a weakness, it was a self-inflicted wound. Damien, the ghost of the soul underworld, the man who felt nothing, had found something to feel. And anything Damien Kwan felt was a vulnerability Jinwoo could exploit. Love, sentiment, nostalgia. These were poisons in their world. Weakness was blood in the water, and Jinwoo was a shark who had been starving for a long, long time. A girl, he mused, tapping a finger against his lips. A chubby little foreigner, from what I hear. How sentimental he looked at his man, his eyes glinting with newfound malice. Find out everything about her. Her name, where she's from, who she talks to, what she breathes. I want to know what kind of key fits this new lock on Damien's heart. He took a long, slow drink of his soju. The game had been a stalemate for too long, but now a new piece was on the board. An insignificant pawn that, in his hands, could be used to checkmate a king. He has given me a weapon, Jinwoo whispered to the stale air, and I'm going to enjoy using it. The kitchen was a cavern of stainless steel and white marble, an industrial space designed for a professional staff, not for intimacy. Yet, in the weeks that followed, it became Amara's sanctuary, and slowly, Damien's as well. He would appear silently while she cooked, standing in the doorway at first, just watching. Then, he started coming closer, drawn by the familiar, comforting ballet of her hands chopping garlic, measuring gochugaru, massaging the sauce into the noodles. Tonight, he stood beside her at the massive island. Show me, he said, his voice a low request. It was the first time he had asked for anything beyond the finished meal. Amara's heart did a little flip. She took a deep breath, the scent of sesame and ginger calming her nerves. Okay, she said softly. The zest is the most important part. My grandmother said Mrs. Park. That was her friend's name. She said it cuts the richness. It adds a memory of sunshine. She showed him how to hold the zestu, her fingers brushing against his. His hands, which she knew could break a man, were surprisingly hesitant, almost clumsy, as he scraped the orange peel. A dusting of bright zest fell onto the cutting board. He looked at it, then at her, a flicker of something warm in his dark eyes. A silent thank you. As she plated the noodles for him, he reached into his pocket. He placed a small, silk-wrapped object on the counter. This was my mother's, he said, his voice thick with an emotion he rarely showed. Amara carefully unwrapped it. Inside lay a simple, elegant jade pendant on a delicate gold chain. It was a deep, translucent green, cool to the touch. It was an impossible gift. A piece of his buried heart offered in exchange for a piece of hers. I can't, she started, her voice trembling. You can, he interrupted gently. He took the pendant and, with an uncharacteristic tenderness, fastened it around her neck. The cool jade rested against her warm skin, a silent, binding promise in the heart of the sterile, steel kitchen. Confidence was a new and unfamiliar garment for Amara. It felt strange, like a dress she hadn't quite grown into yet. Living in the Kwan Tower, she was cocooned in a world of quiet luxury she never could have imagined. Her rent was a forgotten nightmare, her days filled with a simple, satisfying rhythm of cooking. Damien was a quiet, intense presence, but his gratitude was a tangible thing, a warmth that was slowly starting to thaw the fear she'd initially felt. She was no longer just the catering girl, she was the keeper of a sacred memory. Today, she decided to go to the market herself. She had always sent a list with one of Mr. Park's men, But she missed the feeling of choosing her own vegetables, of haggling over the price of ginger, of being part of the city's vibrant, chaotic pulse. She tied the jade pendant Damien had given her under her shirt, a secret anchor of courage against her skin. "I'll be fine," she insisted to a worried Mr. Park. "It's just the market. I'll be back in an hour." The market was a wonderful assault on the senses. The riot of colors, the shouts of the vendors, the smell of street food and fresh produce. For a moment, she felt like a normal girl again. She smiled, haggling playfully for a bag of oranges, the secret to the noodle sauce's sunshine. She didn't notice the two men who detached themselves from the bustling crowd. She didn't see their coordinated movements as they closed in on her from either side. One moment, she was reaching for her wallet. The next, a thick arm was clamped around her waist, another hand covering her mouth, stifling her scream. A sharp, chemical smell filled her nostrils. Her worn tote bag, full of bright oranges, fell to the ground, its contents scattering across the grimy pavement like fallen stars. The world tilted, her knees buckled, and the vibrant chaos of the market dissolved into suffocating darkness. The broken bag of oranges was the first sign. Mr. Park's man, sent to shadow Amara from a distance, found it lying on the ground, the bright fruit scattered and bruised. Panic, cold and sharp, cut through him. He made the call. When the news reached Damien, he was in a meeting, reviewing architectural plans for a new hotel. The words from Mr. Park over the phone, "She's gone," did not register at first. Then they did, and the world fractured. The cold, disciplined armor he wore didn't just crack, it vaporized in a blast of pure, unadulterated rage. It was not the calculated anger of a crime lord whose asset had been compromised. It was the primal fury of a man whose soul had been ripped out. He didn't speak. He simply stood, knocking the heavy oak table over as if it were made of cardboard. Blueprints and models crashed to the floor. His associates scrambled back, their faces pale with terror. They had only ever known the cold Damien. This was something else entirely. This was a volcano. He moved through the city, like a wraith, a specter of vengeance. He was no longer the CEO of Quan Cosmetics. He was the head of the Golden Coil Syndicate again, and he was calling in every debt, every favor, every dark allegiance he had spent a lifetime cultivating. The underworld of Seoul, which had been resting in a tense peace, erupted. Within hours, he knew. Kong Jinwoo. He found him in a derelict warehouse by the docks, the air thick with the smell of rust and low tide. Jinwoo was gloating, standing over Amara, who was tied to a chair, bruised but her eyes blazing with defiance. "You see, Damien?" Jinwoo sneered. All it took was one little thing. One little weakness. Damien didn't answer with words. The ensuing violence was swift, brutal, and deeply personal. He moved with a terrifying grace, dismantling Jinwoo's men not as a boss giving orders, but as a soldier on the front lines. The final confrontation was just him and Jinwoo. It was short. It was not a fight. It was an execution. A quiet end to a loud life. He went to her, cutting the ropes that bound her with a knife he'd taken from one of Jinwoo's men. Her hands were raw, her cheek bruised where she'd been struck. He reached out, his hand hesitating for a moment before gently cupping her face. His thumb brushed away a tear she hadn't realized had fallen. "You're safe," he whispered, his voice ragged with an emotion he could no longer hide. She didn't flinch from his touch. Instead, she leaned into it, a sob of relief shaking her entire body. He pulled her into his arms, holding her tightly against his chest, burying his face in her hair. He held her as if she were the only anchor in a world that had just tried to drown him. He felt the cool, smooth shape of the jade pendant against his own chest, still safe around her neck. It was a promise kept. The ride back to the tower was silent, a cocoon of shared trauma and unspoken relief. He took her not to her apartment, but to his. He cleaned the cut on her cheek himself, his large hands surprisingly gentle, his touch a balm on her terrified spirit. Weeks later, the city was still whispering about the night the underworld went to war. But at the grand opening gala for the flagship Quan Cosmetics store, the whispers were of a different kind. The event was the pinnacle of corporate glamour. Damien Quan stood on the stage, the epitome of cold power in a flawless tuxedo. He was supposed to be introducing the new face of his company, a replacement for the models he had so spectacularly fired. He looked out at the sea of investors, journalists, and socialites. He cleared his throat. "For years, my company has been about creating a mask," he began, his voice resonating through the silent hall. "A perfect, polished facade. I have come to realize that perfection is an illusion. Real value lies in authenticity, in warmth, in memory." He paused, and his eyes found Amara standing in the wings, dressed in a simple but elegant emerald green gown Mr. Park had insisted she wear. He extended a hand to her. "The new face of this company is not a model," he said, his voice ringing with absolute conviction as he drew her to his side. "It is a recipe. It is a memory. It is Miss Amara Jackson, the heart of this enterprise and the keeper of its soul." He held her hand, their fingers lacing together in front of the entire world. A public declaration. She was not his weakness. She was his strength.